How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the Taped Podcast, the most rubbish podcast in the world, where your host is always myself, MickyT.
And me, Nostalgia.
And joining us today for another edition of our Worst to Best series is two lads that have been on with us before. It's one of them more recently, the other one not in a long time, so please give a warm welcome to Josh and Koner1.
Hello.
Da boys.
I'd actually like to
The
be...
lads have made it. They're here.
Boys.
My name is actually Dan Abnormal. Please refer to me as such.
Okay, Dan. How are you doing, Dan? Nice to meet you, Dan.
Nice to meet you. I'm doing very good. I'm excited to do this episode on an artist that I have absolutely no attachment to whatsoever.
And I'm assuming that artist you have no attachment to whatsoever is a little Britpop and alternative rock band from the 90s that you probably never heard of. They have a guy who's a bit of a gorilla in the band, but you know, you probably never heard of him. They're called Blur.
Mm-hmm.
Oh shit!
Yeah.
I thought we were doing sweet.
And yeah, we're going to be ranking the entire Blur discography today. And before we do so, I just want to quickly just mention something here, and I want to get a general consensus on something. So, Blur is better than Oasis.
Facts.
Yeah.
That's true.
I spit nothing but facts.
I mean,
And
here's the thing. Oasis may have a couple good albums, but they're not in my top 10 favorite bands of all time. That's the difference.
I mean,
and
I like the two Oasis albums, but not really much to say
honestly,
about
Oasis,
even those ones.
Oasis,
Go ahead.
Oasis just have the one album for me, honestly.
Nah, two for me, but like
Yeah, 2 for me.
Blur have several.
And yeah, with that in mind, though, we're going to be ranking the entire Blur discography. We have 8 albums here. We're going to be starting from Leisure all the way up to 13. No live albums, demos, comps, or anything like that. Just the studio albums. And yeah, without wasting any more time, let's get right into it. Starting at our number 8 spot.
Did you say
And I chose
13?
Yeah, no, not 13. Me shit. Well, my bad.
I was like, wait.
The magic whip. Leisure up to the magic whip. My bad. Fuck. I'm reading my notes wrong. Fuck. Number 8, Leisure.
Number 8, Leisure.
Number 8, Leisure.
Number 8, Leisure.
Oh, you said it wrong.
Oh, I did.
Nothing controversial here at all. So
I was going to be shocked if this wasn't the last pick, honestly.
yeah, to be fair. So yeah, Blur's debut, Leisure, the album that kickstarts the legacy of the band that we know and love, and it also happens to be their worst album in my opinion. And while it's not an awful or even mediocre album, it's all in all just an okay album. Nothing more, nothing less. You know, Leisure isn't without its highlights, of course. You know, She's So High and Slow Down especially are fantastic moments on this album, but the rest of the album is very hit or miss for me, with a bunch of tracks that I think are just fine or either boring. You know, plus, Blur haven't really hitched upon a sound that they could call their own yet, and, you know, out of the gate, the band dabbled heavily in the baggy Manchester sound. You know, the sound of this thing, you know, it's very psychedelic, kind of alt-rocky, and while it's interesting to see, you know, a band like Blur start off with something that sounds like this, I don't think they put much of an interesting or unique spin on the sounds they explore. You know, I do like the guitar tones and the atmospheric production, but I just feel like a lot of the songwriting needed a bit of work, since not much of it really sticks with me, and it's just not really that memorable or interesting overall. I mean, it's a starting point, and they'd obviously be getting better past this point, but, you know, a starting point is a starting point, and this happens to be where Blur started, I guess. So yeah, Blur's debut is okay. There isn't really much else to say about it, except that it's the band's debut, and it's the Pablo Honey of the Blur discography, except Pablo Honey isn't that bad.
Pablo Honey is great. I will die on this hill. It's a great album.
This isn't a video to die on a hill for.
It's a hill that I will die on for the rest of my life.
Right. Well, Leisure. I think, you know, every band has to start somewhere, and Blur just so happened to start by doing their worst Stone Roses impression. I'm going to be honest, the baggy style just does nothing to complement the band's dynamic, and the album as a whole is just, it's very thin. A lot of the tracks come together quite awkwardly. And the cleverness to the lyrics that's so present on future Blur albums just doesn't really exist here. The lyrics and vocals almost just feel like a placeholder a lot of the time. The instrumentation is okay, and it has its moments, but it's definitely quite derivative of bands like the Stone Roses and other bands in the Manchester scene. So yeah, it doesn't feel like a Blur album at all, and it's really no wonder that Damon Albarn doesn't really look back on this project very fondly. Why would he?
Yeah, I mean, it's baby Blur. They're just finding their footing, and I think with this album, it's an okay first outing, but it leaves so much to be desired. Like, even without any context of like the rest of their discography, this is just like kind of boring. Like, there's good songs to be had on here for sure, but I don't know. It's like, even like with the baggy sound that's going on here, and I think you put it brilliantly, Nostalgia, where this literally just sounds like an attempt to be like a Stone Roses copy, but it's like not as interesting as that classic debut album of theirs. And I don't know, like some of the stuff like where they try to go like shoegazy on this album, it's like this is what shoegaze would sound like without like any shoegaze effects. Like, there's no reverb, so it just sounds weird. It's like if you just like stripped all of the reverb and like mysticism and echo away from like any shoegaze album. Like, it just sounds weird and naked, and like this isn't even good shoegaze anyway. Like, I wouldn't say like, oh, with the the right effects on so and so song, it could be great. Like, it's just like, I don't know, it's boring. Like, songs like, I don't know, like Birthday or Repetition, yeah, I'll say, but it's just an album where it's like the band is, it's like they're definitely trying to find their footing, and it shows on this album. And again, there's some great songs on this album, some Blur classics, but the boring songs sort of outweigh the good at most points in the album. And honestly, there's a couple B-sides and unreleased tracks that were on this album, like Inertia and I Know, and I feel like if those were on the album, it'd actually make it better. But instead we get, songs like Bad Day and High Cool, and like, there's a problem that happened on this album that I noticed where some songs will be either the verse is really good and the chorus is really bad, or it's the opposite effect where the verse is terrible but the chorus is great. But like the one that always sticks in my mind is Come Together, where the verses is like okay, but then the chorus on it is like laughably terrible. Like, I don't know. It's a weird album. It's not great. If you're going to start listening to this band, don't start at the beginning. Just, I don't know, find whatever album you think that you'll like based on what we say further down the line. But yeah, this is just kind of a mediocre release.
Yeah. So my sentiments pretty much echo those of what you guys said. And Josh, I think the phrase you're looking for is barefoot shoegaze. So yeah. my overall feeling about this record is that I think, Mickey, it was you that said this. I think this album suffers from the Pablo Honey syndrome, in which the stuff that comes after it and Blur's discography just completely overshadows it in terms of quality. And as a result, it just becomes every diehard fan's favorite punching bag. But with that said, I don't think Leisure is a bad album by any means. I actually think there's quite a few highlights on here. As a matter of fact, a fairly big portion of it is just kind of whatever. And I think there was one song on here that in particular that just sucks ass. So, and there's some really bad instrumental choices on here, without a doubt. Like on Bad Day, which Josh mentioned, I don't know who thought an accordion was a good idea. And whoever thought to include Birthday on this album should have been shot into the fucking sun. But the good stuff is pretty fucking great, honestly. Sing has this like hypnotic aura to it that I've always admired. And I appreciate that song more after seeing it in Trainspotting, which you guys should watch if you haven't seen. And then There's No Other Way, which Josh will agree with me. Well, this is my most played Blur song. And it might be my favorite of theirs. I could probably sing along to it. I could sing along to it like all day. And I like some other moments too. like there's good stuff on this album, like I said, but not enough good stuff to make a good album.
All right, and with that in mind, my favorite tracks off of Leisure are She's So High and Slow Down. My least favorite tracks are Bad Day and Sing.
My favorite tracks are She's So High, Fool, and Wear Me Down. My least favorite track is Come Together.
My favorites are She's So High, Bang, Sing, and There's No Other Way. My least favorites are Repetition, Bad Day, Come Together, High Cool, and Birthday.
My favorite tracks are She's So High, Sing, There's No Other Way, and honorable mention to Fool. And my least favorite is obviously Birthday. That song sucks.
Yeah, it's not great.
Okay, and with that in mind, we're going to move on to our number 7 picks, and I chose The Great Escape.
I chose The Magic Whip.
Phew. Okay, I'll preface that we're in 8 out of 10 territory for me, so we're already here at good albums. My number 7 pick is Think Tank.
And my number 7 pick is The Magic Whip.
I'm not quite in good album territory yet, but I'm nearly there.
Well, we'll do Koner then, Josh. So Koner can go
Okay.
first.
Okay. So, yeah, The Great Escape, the 4th album in the Blur discography, and it is famously the album that went up against Oasis's What's the Story, Morning Glory. It pretty much won the war when it came to, won the battle, should I say, when it came to first week chart success, but in the long run, Oasis kind of won the war in terms of longevity and memorability when we compare the two albums. Meanwhile, I guess The Great Escape would be pretty much forgotten about in the grander scheme of 90s music, and Damon Albarn himself even thinks this one is like one of 2 bad albums he's made in his career. I really hope the other one is Humans, and while I don't really think that this album is bad in any way, shape, or form, it easily ranks as one of the band's weaker albums, in my opinion. For me, The Great Escape just seems like Blur were running out of ideas and not really bringing a fresh take on their established sound. It just seems like they were only making this album, to please, since Park Life was a monumental moment for them. Blur stick to their Britpop sound in this thing. They still conceptually write these vignettes on the British middle-class society with, the clever wit and observations we know them for. And they still end up making some really catchy tunes out of them, but for a fair amount of it, and by that I mean the whole second half of the album, bar one song, Blur just come off uninspired and awkward on this one. Like, these tracks specifically feel a bit ill-conceived, they feel redundant, and they feel like ideas that, should have gone further, but unfortunately they didn't. But I would be lying to you if I said I didn't have highlights from this album, and it definitely has its highlights, some of which are some of the best that they've ever made in their Britpop era, and one of these tracks in particular ranks as one of my favorite Blur songs ever. I do think it's pretty well produced, and I think that the highlights are enough to bring this album into decent territories. But as a whole, I just feel like it's a bit of a misfire on Blur's end, and despite its success, it doesn't really warrant that much replay value for me.
Well, I went with the band's most recent project, The Magic Whip. And honestly, there's not really a whole lot to say about this project, in my opinion. The Magic Whip, instead of progressing the band's sound further, I feel like it just tries to capture the sound of their late 90s material. And as a whole, I feel like it's a bit of a leap backwards creatively for the band. It's just not that impressive. It's not that memorable. It certainly has some great moments, but, honestly, it would be a stretch, to say that this was a highlight in their career. It's just, for me personally, far too safe, and I really don't have much to say about it.
So I also put The Magic Whip in my number 7 spot, and I just wanted to start things off by telling you guys the story of Blurgate, if you guys aren't familiar with that story. So in 2015, Anthony Fantano posted a review of The Magic Whip that he quickly deleted because it was actually a series of pitch shifted and played around with deep cuts from Blur and Gorillaz, which is classic.
Memories.
Memories, yeah. But yeah, so I saw a reviewer on RYM that's somewhat popular. He said that Magic Whip was well-produced garbage that was Blur's second worst album. And I agree with 2 of those statements. The one I disagree with is it being garbage. So, in my eyes, a comeback album after 12-year silence is pretty hard to judge fairly if you're as big of a fan of this band as I am. So, when it came out, I was just glad to have more new material from one of my favorite bands. And looking back on it years later, I see it as a good collection of tracks with plenty that I absolutely love, and a couple that I just don't like quite as much as others. I think there's always a lot of pressure put on a band of this kind of stature to deliver something great on a comeback record after being silent for so long. But I think on this record, Blur doesn't sound like a band that was bothered by that expectation that was placed on them. I think they just sound comfortable with themselves. Like, there's no big risks taken on this album. There's no attempts to stretch themselves too far. But I mean, why should they? They've already proven themselves as one of the best bands to come out of their scene. And I honestly feel like if they fell into the mindset that they had to make something epic after such a long break, I think this album would have turned out much differently and for the worse. So, yeah.
Yeah. So my number 7 pick is Think Tank, and I know that it's like super cool, or like at least it was cool back in the day to like totally like dookie all over this album and that it was bad. I don't think it's bad. I actually used to like it a lot more than I do now. I used to have it as like one of my favorite Blur albums of all time. I thought it was great. And I like to affectionately call this album the unofficial second Gorillaz album. Because I think we can all agree this is definitely the weirdest album in their discography, and it's definitely the most divisive amongst fans. Either you love this thing or you think it's absolutely horrendous. And I really like this album. Again, it has kind of shrunk on me over the years, but I still think it's really solid. It's I don't know. That's kind of why I call it the second Gorillaz album, because it's always weird when I see people are like, "Oh, this album's terrible," but man, that self-titled Gorillaz album's pretty good, guys. It's like I guess it could be to its hindrance, is that it does stray too much into like the sound that Damon was tinkering with his other band, and that's kind of why that band formed in the first place. So then for it to bleed into Blur, I guess I get where people come from when they slag the album off, but I just think it's a good time. I mean, there are some areas where it's a bit self-indulgent at some times, and it kind of goes on for a little bit, at least for some songs. But I think it's a great record that really doesn't warrant the hate that it gets, and it's definitely not their worst album. Like, even if it's this low on the list, I would never say it's their worst album.
All right. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Great Escape are Stereotypes, Country House, Best Days, Charmless Man, Fade Away, Top Man, The Universal, and Globe Alone. My least favorite tracks are Dan Abnormal and Entertain Me.
My favorite tracks on the Magic Whip are Lonesome Street, Ghost Ship, and Pyongyang. My least favorite track is I Broadcast.
My favorite tracks on the Magic Whip are Lonesome Street, Thought It Was a Spaceman, Ghost Ship, Ong Ong, and my least favorite is Pyongyang because North Korea is bad.
All right, my favorites on Think Tank were Out of Time, Crazy Beat, Good Song, Caravan, Sweet Song, and Jets, and my least favorite was Brothers and Sisters.
And with that in mind, moving on to our number 6 picks, and I chose Modern Life is Rubbish.
I chose Blur.
Oh. I mean, I'm kind of facepalming to both of your picks, but damn. Now this is one where it was very hard to pick between 5 and 6, but I ended up going with my number 6 pick as The Great Escape.
I also picked The Great Escape as my number 6.
Normal order, so.
Let's go.
Alright, so Modern Life is Rubbish. Blur's sophomore album. It may not be one of my favorites from the band, but it's still a pretty good album if you ask me. And for me, it was an important progression from their debut, since I feel like it would be a step forward in the evolution of Blur's sound, and they would finally be able to form it. Like this is the formation of the Britpop sound that they were going with. And they would only perfect it on the album after, but, it's still a good stepping stone. Now, in contrast with the debut, Modern Life is Rubbish saw Blur begin to embrace their more Britpop sound, which they would become known for throughout the 90s UK music scene. And, they would begin to incorporate more pop-oriented sounds from, that feel very reminiscent of, 60s pop rock, a la the Beatles, the Kinks, and the Who. And Blur also used this album as a way to make character studies based on, the modern British individuals who have their own things going on, they have their own personalities, and I feel like Damon does a great job at writing these characters in a fun and interesting way, and especially with how witty that he can be. Now, outside of that, though, the songs on this album are really good. There's plenty of incredibly catchy and infectious tracks on this album that have great hooks, fun instrumentation, and great performances. There's a youthful energy to this album that I can always appreciate, and despite it being a bit inconsistent, there was a lot of great tracks that I really fucked with and took away from the album. The main issues that I have with the album as a whole, though, is that it just has a handful of tracks that are a bit boring, not mediocre by any means, but they're just incredibly uninteresting and don't really add anything to the grander scheme of the album. Also, there were a few hooks here and there that just don't really sound all that fleshed out, and they just kind of come off a little awkward for me. And I don't have much else to say about Modern Life is Rubbish. I just think it's a pretty good album. It's a necessary stepping stone for the band. And yeah, they would expand further upon these ideas and, get better over time. But, Modern Life is Rubbish definitely stands out on its own as, an important moment for Blur, in my opinion.
Yeah, I went with their self-titled, and first of all, I think it's good. But overall, while this album is a more experimental direction for Blur, which on face value is definitely more than welcome, I think the project at times to me doesn't feel like it's executing what it wants to execute. Overall, this more dark, more lo-fi and more psychedelic release sees the band take a step back from their iconic Britpop sound. But aside from, a few standout tracks, this album just doesn't really present anything that I find to be that cohesive, and the more rugged and noisy production style just really doesn't do a lot to save some tracks that I just find quite boring. Obviously if an album starts with Beetle Bum and Song 2 back to back, it can't be that bad, and it's definitely not. It's just, when compared to the rest of their discography, I just think that it's one of the least significant albums in their discography. I just don't get that much enjoyment out of it, aside from a few absolute standouts. And it just, to me, doesn't feel that well executed.
Man.
Sad.
Yeah.
That actually
That's
kind of
fair.
stings, holy fuck.
Fair, but...
Get over it.
Hey now, don't be rude like
I'm gonna
that.
get a Tic Tac now, so enjoy the sound.
All right, but for my
Fuck
number
you.
6 pick, okay, this is gonna be a good episode. For number 6, I picked The Great Escape. I think this album's really good. I'm just gonna come out and say it. I think this album's great. This album sort of sounds like the transition between the sounds of Britpop and the alt rock that they would dive into in between these albums. Like it's the perfect bridge between Park Life and the self-titled. This album is just a great time on both fronts. There's bangers left and right on this album. It does sort of have a strange flow to it, because there are songs where it's like, oh, we are trying introspective songs now, and we are trying feel good and sometimes slightly experimental for us songs, but then you have a straight up Britpop song like Charmless Man, which is a fantastic song. But then, then you get songs like Best Days or He Thought of Cars, which are, again, great songs, but, it's just kind of like it doesn't mesh as well as it could. It just, sometimes it kind of feels like an uneven listen, but, I mean, the songs are there. When this album hits, it knocks you on your ass, and, I think this goes without saying, The Universal is one of the best Britpop songs and Blur songs ever written.
Yes.
That song is absolutely fantastic.
Absolutely.
It's a masterpiece, and that's why it kind of pains me to put it at number 6, because this album is really good and chocked full of great songs. But it's just, it's Blur. They got good stuff. They got good music. Just it's out there. Just go and listen to it and just cry a little bit whenever you hear that. It really, really, really could happen on Universal.
So, The Great Escape, yeah, I had that in the same spot as Josh. So, I think for this particular album, despite being enjoyable overall. I think it really made it clear that Blur jumped the Britpop ship at the right time. Oasis. And also that pun there about jumping off a ship, absolutely not intended. Don't think that it was. So the fact that this is my second most scrabbled Blur album, despite being considerably low on my ranking, I think really is a testament to sort of how uneven this album is. So the 3 main singles are all incredible. Like, they really, truly are. The thing is that just the rest of the songs, they sort of just pale in comparison to varying degrees. And I think the last third of the track listing does kind of fall off in quality. The thing that strikes me as funny about this record is that at certain points, it feels like Blur is taking the piss at Britpop by writing Britpop songs, if that makes any sense. At least like the songs that have very obvious sarcasm in their lyrics come across that way. But I think the fatal flaw of this album that it's just not very concise. It could have been 3 or 4 songs shorter. And then similar to what Josh says, I can't like talk about this album without calling out Universal. Because it's miles better than any other song on this record, for being quite honest. And it's miles better than a lot of the other songs. Wait. According to my notes, I wrote, but it's also miles better than a lot of songs in the history of forever, pretty much. That's a horrible line. That's horrible. I think this song... Sense. Yeah, it does. I think this song, like, alone pretty much absolved Blur of the sins they committed on Leisure. And it really puts a lot of other Britpop hits to shame. I can keep going on the song if you guys want. I'll just briefly mention that one performance. I think it was from the London Olympics where they played this. I think it was one of like the last songs they played, and like right before the instrumental outro at the end, Damon just like says thank you and like stares out into the crowd like he's gonna cry. That's a great emotional moment. And that's like probably my favorite Blur moment like ever. But yeah, Universal, amazing. Great Escape, pretty good.
Alright, and with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Modern Life is Rubbish are For Tomorrow, Advert, Colin Zeal, Star-Shaped, Blue Jeans, Chemical World, Someday Sunday, Villa Rosie, and Turn It Up. My least favourite tracks are Pressure on Julian, Coping, and Resigned.
My favourite tracks on Blur are Beetle Bum, Song 2, and You're So Great. My least favourite track is I'm Just a Killer for Your Love.
Oof. My favorites on Great Escapes, Jesus, were Stereotypes, Country House, Charmless Man, Fade Away, The Universal, because, of course, He Thought of Cars, and Globe Alone. My least favorites were Arnold Same and Yuko and Hero.
My favorites are The Universal, Country House, Charmless Man, Stereotypes, He Thought of Cars, and my least favorite is an obvious pick for me personally. It's Arnold Same.
It's time to kick off the top 5 of our lists. So with that in mind, my number 5 pick is Think Tank.
My number 5 pick is also Think Tank.
My number 5 pick is The Magic Whip.
My number 5 pick is the self-titled album.
Okay. Alright, so Think Tank, their only album in the 2000s. Which is, it's a bit of a weird one in their discography. Not only because, Blur were still experimenting a little, but also because you can kind of hear, like, the band's ventures outside of Blur being influenced on them. Like, obviously, Damon especially. I feel like elements of Gorillaz definitely show it themselves here. And, there's a few tracks on here that definitely give off that kind of, like, Gorillaz self-titled-esque vibe. And I get why a lot of people will call it, like, quote-unquote, the hidden Gorillaz, like, second album. It's funny, but like I think it's still a really good album either way. I don't think those comparisons really take away much enjoyment from the album for me, because honestly, this album is a really good attempt from Blur, even if I feel like it is a little hit or miss. No, the more that I think about it, the more that I wish Blur got to dabble in more down-tempo electronic music, because they really did some justice to that sound on a few cuts here for me. Plus, I like the album's best moments and the way that they blend with the art rock and alt rock sounds that they were doing previously. And, it makes for some fantastic tracks in my opinion. I feel like the soundscapes are solid, there's some great bass parts all over this thing, the production is really good, and the performances from the band are very solid. Not to mention, this album has a great handful of highlights that are just simultaneously just so engrossing, yet so fun. But like I said, I feel like this album is a bit hit or miss. there's a fair amount of tracks in here that just simply don't do anything for me and just come off like they're just outright boring. The performances from Damon Albarn on those tracks especially come off a little bit unmemorable and a bit underwhelming. I feel like the tracks structurally just aren't all that interesting to me, and generally I'm just left with a feeling like, this is fine. None of these songs are bad. None of these songs are just, downright awful. But they're just not that good in comparison with the best tracks on here, in my opinion. So yeah, Think Tank, I think, is a really good album. It's solid. It's cool to see that Blur are still experimenting, and for what it's worth, some of these experiments pay off very well, but some don't. Either way, it's a very respectable effort from them.
Yeah, I think this album's really underrated, and it's probably the least talked about record in their entire discography, possibly because it's the only one without Graham. But this album, even though Graham was the one who kept the band, he was the glue that kept the band together at times. Even without Graham, they still managed to create something really fulfilling, something really exciting, and they go in directions that they never explored before. I did go into this record with my expectations rather low because, no Graham. But I was met with one of the most unique and forward-thinking projects in Blur's entire catalogue. I think that Think Tank embraces electronic music more than anything that came before it in their discography. And it mixes those aspects with, the more art rock direction that they explored on their self-titled and on 13, and the culmination of all of that is one of the most unique projects in their discography. It feels very mechanical, it feels very tense at times, but throughout it still retains that Blur magic, and in my opinion it's like the closest that the band have ever gotten to sounding like Gorillaz. And overall it's a great record. It has some absolute highlights, and I don't think Crazy Beat is as bad as everyone says it is.
That song
slaps.
fantastic.
Who hates that song?
Check Rate Your Music.
Like it. It's like by far the it's by far the lowest rated song on the album. It's like barely has a 3.0, but like that song slaps so hard. I do not understand.
Dude, fuck Rate Your Music. That song is great.
It's so good. That song is so good.
RWM users, get your shit together. Fucking hell.
Again, I need to reiterate, Think Tank is a great album. I agree with all that you all were saying. It's a great album. Don't underrate it, please. It doesn't deserve it. Speaking of underrated, The Magic Whip. I don't know why I feel so alone in this opinion, because I feel like this album is fantastic for Blur. It's a wonderful, colorful, magical return to form with some new sound palettes that like kind of add to the classic Blur style, because I mean there are songs that feel reminiscent of the Britpop days, but I feel like it combines all the things that Blur have kind of worked with and crafted over their amazing discography, mixed with some things that Damon was doing on his solo work. I get Everyday Robot vibes on some of these songs, and for context, I love that album. Like, I think that album is absolutely fantastic. So I mean, you're not going to hear any complaining from me from this album. I don't know. I know that people tend to underrate this album too. I mean, Think Tank used to be the one that people underrated like crazy. But I think that album, even though it sometimes doesn't get its due justice, people still kind of consider that one very high up in the echelon of Blur. But I think this album is the new Think Tank for people, where like they just underrate it, and I just think it's fantastic. I think the introspectiveness on this album, where it sounds like a band reforming, which it kind of is, because this is the album that brings Graham back into the band, and there's some heartbreaking songs, particularly My Terracotta Heart, where it talks about their friendship, and I can't help but cry every time I listen to that song. I feel like that is a beautiful tribute to this amazing band. I think that song is a huge highlight on this album, along with plenty of other songs that are they're just bangers. Like I don't think I need to explain any more further with like Lonesome Street and There Are Too Many of Us and Ong Ong. I think people generally like those songs, but I don't know. I I just really like this album. I think honestly, I feel like the album cover suits it very well, where it's like very like luscious and colorful album, and I don't know. I think that this is their most underrated album for sure.
So my number 5 pick was the self-titled record. So this is the album that I think shows Blur as having far more musical prowess than the acts they were competing against in the spotlight just like 2 years before this came out. You know, you have Pulp, which went in a more moodier direction with This Is Hardcore, and then you had Oasis, who just straight up didn't even try to do anything new. Well, they did with Be Here Now, completely bombed. That's the reason that like 90% of their discography is whack. But anyways, so the self-titled album, it has a lot more to it than just the funny woo-woo song. Any album that's influenced by Pavement is all right in my book. You guys may or may not know how much I fucking love Pavement, but honestly, yeah, like this album, it's great. Honestly, I will say that I think some of the more experimental, at least some of the experimental songwriting choices don't really work. Like the Twisted Carnival theme of retro is pretty boring, and I think Essex Dogs, the closing track, just is really, really freaking boring. But nearly every single song is a hit for me outside of those two. I think what I really appreciate about this album is the simple idea of the band trying to evolve their sound in an interesting direction. But with that said, in the grand scheme of 90s alt rock, it's not all that unique. But not everything has to be in order to be good. And I would just say, let's be grateful that this album didn't bomb in the mainstream, because given everything going on with this band behind the scenes, like during this era, I don't think it's too far-fetched to say it like might have been one of, if not their last album, if it was unsuccessful commercially. But yeah, this album's pretty good.
All right. And with that in mind, my favorite tracks from Think Tank are Ambulance, Crazy Beat, Good Song, On the Way to the Club, We've Got a File on You, Moroccan People's Revolutionary Bowls Club, Sweet Song, and Battery in Your Leg. My least favorite tracks are Caravan and Jets.
My favorite tracks are Ambulance, Out of Time, Good Song, On the Way to the Club, Brothers and Sisters, Sweet Song, Jets, and Battery in Your Leg. My least favorite track is Moroccan People's Revolutionary Bowls Club.
Aww. That song's a banger.
Sorry, man.
Yeah, Jets is a banger. Jets is a banger too.
Okay.
But, you know.
Ah.
Justice. My favorites on the Magic Whip are Lonesome Street, New World Towers, Thought I Was a Spaceman, My Terracotta Heart, There Are Too Many of Us, Ghost Ship, and Ong Ong. And my least favorite is Pyongyang.
My favorite songs on the self-titled Blur album are Beetle Bum, Song 2, and I'll never get tired of the irony of how that song got popular. You're so great, Death of a Party, Look Inside America, and my least favorites are the ones I mentioned when I was talking about this theme from Retro and Essex Dogs.
All right, we're at the halfway point of our list now. And with that in mind, my number 4 pick, I was about to say my favorite track, okay. All right, my number 4 pick is The Magic Whip.
My number 4 pick is Modern Life is Rubbish.
Yes, Mickey. Yes. You understand.
I do.
Now, and Mickey, I'll throw you a bone because I've heard you sighing. We're in 9 out of 10 territory for this band. My 4th pick is the self-titled.
And my 4th pick is Modern Life is Rubbish.
Okay. Josh, you can go after me then.
Alrighty.
Alright, so, The Magic Whip, the latest album in Blur's discography, and it's one that came out after a 12-year-long hiatus, and it's one of those comeback records that turns out to be a really good one, and it manages to display that, you know, Blur still have a knack for making fun and interesting music still, even when we consider that at the time they're 25 years in as a band. And I'll definitely agree with Josh when I say that this is the most underrated Blur album. Simply put, I think this thing is really fucking good. Now, The Magic Whip is almost like a continuation of the band's later sound of alt rock and art rock, but in a more updated sound for the modern age in terms of its polished production. You know, it somewhat returns to the band's somewhat poppy tendencies, and it ditches the noisy and raw feel of projects like 13 and Blur. And for me, a lot of what they do here mostly works because there's some fantastic cuts on here that are all intricate, colorful, well written, and honestly very gratifying. But the band's performances are really solid throughout. Damon Albarn sounds really good. He sounds as good as ever. There's some fantastic moments that run the gamut of psychedelic art rock bliss and fun pop rock with some Britpop undertones. And for me, it's mostly consistent with some really great tracks all over its track list, some of which, honestly, that I've been coming back to a fair amount, and some of which that I would probably rank as some of Blur's best songs, personally. My main issue with the album, though, is that I do feel like it can kind of blend together a little and come off a little one note. And obviously, it doesn't drive Blur's sound forward that much, but that honestly doesn't bother me when I'm actually really fucking with what's going on here, because I genuinely think the songs at the core are really great and really fun. There's a fair amount of tracks on here that I do feel like don't really do too much for me personally, but besides that, there's a lot of tracks that I do like on the Magic Whip. As a whole, I do think it's a really solid comeback album from the boys, and it's definitely something to note in their discography, in my opinion. So, yeah, the Magic Whip at number 4.
Thank you, Mickey. Thank you, my bass boy.
You're welcome. I love you too. Thank you.
So my number 4 pick is the self-titled. Now, please don't get me wrong. Just because it's at number 4 doesn't mean this album is absolutely fantastic. This is their first dive into a sound that's completely divorced from Britpop, and it pays off super well. This is kind of the beginning of their dive into the introspective and sadder songs and lyrics, and it makes for a hard-hitting and potent album that does get the emotions going. We all love the funny song, the song, and it's very ironic how this album used Song 2 to critique America's alternative rock scene, and then at the same time when that happened, this album and that song in particular became the first crossover to the US for this band. Yeah, that's funny, really funny. It's still a banger though. That song is still absolutely fantastic. Doesn't matter what it is, it's just goes hard, and anyone who doesn't think so, those people scare me. But besides Song 2, this album is just really, really emotional, and I think the sound that they started going into is really, I think it fits them really well for sure on this album. And I mean, starting off with Beetle Bum, where it's just this really sad song about Damon's drug addiction. It's such a potent song. Beetle Bum is one of their best songs for sure. And the vibes, I guess, the emotional vibes just keep coming on this album, and it introduces some songwriting from Graham and vocals from him as well. This is to my knowledge, I could be completely wrong, but this is the first time that we hear him on vocals, and honestly, You're So Great is a major highlight on this album. Not only on this album, but honestly, in my opinion, in Blur's entire discography. That song is so emotional and so powerful, and it's just Graham and his guitar. It's so good. And while, if I may keep jerking this album off, even though this album isn't my absolute favorite from Blur, I will say that Death of a Party is probably my second favorite Blur song. That song hits on another level. This album is fantastic. The only issue I have is that I really wish that the songs, that the interlude and the final track wasn't on the album, or at least wasn't on the album in the form that they take, which that's kind of what's disappointing about this album sometimes, is that I'm listening to it and I'm having an amazing time, and then I get to the final act of the album, the final song, and then it just kind of is unfulfilling, and that kind of irks me a little bit, but that's beside the point. This album is amazing.
I went for Modern Life is Rubbish. Leisure doesn't exist. This is the first Blur album, or at least it's the first real Blur album. Britpop definitely takes center stage here, and long gone are the days of Damon Albarn trying to do his best Stone Roses impression. While I don't think it's the best Blur album, it definitely does, a lot of things really, really well. And most importantly, it set the groundwork for Damon Albarn and company to really come into their own. And, it definitely gave them a lot more identity as a band, rather than, whatever they were doing on their very bleak debut. On Modern Life is Rubbish, Blur tackle British life and all that comes with being, a working class British citizen in the most sincere way, one could ever hope to portray these feelings in music, from the perspective of real working class British people. Similarly to some future Blur albums, as well as work from other Britpop acts, namely Pulp, Damon Albarn really portrays, the ups and downs of British life in a way that doesn't romanticize it, but in a way also does. It kind of romanticizes how unromantic it can be in a very tongue-in-cheek and a very unique and just sometimes even funny way. Songwriting and performances are just infectious. They're addictively catchy. The instrumentation, while not always very complex, it definitely sets a very anthemic backbone to the songs about, again, the least anthemic and most mundane things you can imagine. And, it's all in all one of the most charmingly bleak albums, and it's definitely a step forward for the band, for lack of a better word. If not even the first step towards greatness.
So, Modern Life is Rubbish. So, I don't remember who said this or where I saw it or if it came to me in a dream, but the best description I can think of for Modern Life is Rubbish is that it makes the jump from Pablo Honey to the Bends look easy. I don't think you can really deny this album's importance to the band's growth, and it really truly is an insane jump in quality compared to Leisure. A large part of what carries this album for me is Graham's guitar work. His unique playing style really starts to take shape on this album. The album is full of too many good vocal hooks to keep track of and plenty of memorable riffs. And overall, I just think this is an extremely enjoyable record with hardly any skips at all. I think the story of Blur's mission for this album, the fact that Blur's mission for this album was to make it as British as possible after hating their first tour in the US is really funny to me. Even if that tour is the reason that I'm never going to see them playing in concert in the United States. So thanks a lot, Grunge, for that one. But yeah, I really like this album.
All right, and with that in mind, my favorite tracks from The Magic Whip are Ice Cream Man, I Broadcast, My Terracotta Heart, Ghost Trip, Pyongyang, Ong Ong, and Mirrorball. My least favorite tracks are probably New World Towers and There Are Too Many of Us.
My favorite tracks are For Tomorrow, Colin Zeal, Blue Jeans, Chemical World, Super Sunday, Oily Water, Villa Rosie, Coping, and Turn It Up. My least favorite track is Pressure on Julian.
Nope. I'll go because I had the same album. So I had a For Tomorrow for straight shout out to the extended Primrose Hill edition. Blue Jeans, love those harmonies on that song. It's great. I actually have a funny story about that song. So there's a line in that song about buying shoes on Portobello Road on a Saturday, and I lived in London for a little bit, and I had plans to do that and recreate that lyric, but it never happened. I have not forgiven myself for it yet.
Go back to London and do it. I beg.
I will someday. Chemical World. Shout out to the interlude at the end of that, which appears in Baby Driver and is probably the most brilliant use of a build in film. Miss America and Turn It Up. And my least favorite is probably Pressure on Julian.
No.
And I hope Julian is doing okay though.
True.
Oh, he's doing fine. He's fronting the Strokes.
True. My favorites from the Blur self-titled are Beetle Bum, Song 2, Country Sad Ballad Man, MOR, You're So Great, Death of a Party, Chinese Bombs, Look Inside America, Strangers from Another Star, and Moving On. And my least favorites were Theme from Retro and Essex Dogs.
we're in the top 3.
Yeah.
And for me, my number 3 pick is Park Life.
My number 3 pick is The Great Escape.
Sorry. Whoo, man, that kind of hurt a little bit. I like put like a weird thing in my back.
Oh shit! I broke his back.
My number 3 pick is Modern Life is Rubbish.
My number 3 pick, and this is where you guys are probably going to start realizing that something is off about my list. I have number 3, 13.
Ah, okay.
Ow.
Right.
Ow. I'm going to go to a chiropractor after this.
We're really just killing your back, Josh. Holy shit.
Ooh, it's getting stiff.
Alright, so, Park Life. Oh yes. Blur's legendary 3rd album, most likely the band's most iconic album, Park Life. An album that pretty much solidified them as one of the most important bands, not only in Britpop, but in the grander scheme of the 90s UK music canon. And it's a very good album overall, in my opinion. You know, Blur pretty much struck upon a sound and style that would become iconic to them on the album that preceded Park Life, but in many ways, they only began to refine and build upon the personality that Modern Life is Rubbish displayed. Park Life still continues on with the caricature of British culture and identities with all the snark and cynical humour that we see Damon Albarn do previously, and the lyrics are still chock full of personality and wit. Not to mention, they coincide well with some unforgettable hooks in core songs that are just so damn catchy and very memorable. Plus, I feel like Park Life excels Modern Life is Rubbish by the simple fact that it is just much more of a consistent and exciting album. The highs on this album, to say the least, are fantastic. They are easily some of the best produced, most memorable and timeless moments in their discography. They have hooks for days, catchy instrumentation, clever lyrics, and generally just fantastic performances from everyone involved. The energy of this album is just great. But I just have one major gripe with the album, and that's the fact that I feel like the album has a bit of filler here and there. And they mostly come in the form of these very short tracks that don't go anywhere or add to the flow of the album. The one at the end is the only exception because that one's actually really fucking funny to me. But the ones that are just thrown in the middle just don't do anything for me, and they just kind of feel like they're there for the sake of being there. Who knows? They probably thought it was funny. Just haha, funny sound. Put it there. Okay, it's fine. It's a great. But besides that, I do really like Park Life. I get why people would consider it a classic, but despite my grievances, I still think it's a really good album all around. There's so many fantastic moments on here, some iconic Britpop tracks, and some of which are easily some of the best that Blur have ever written. But there's only 2 albums that I prefer.
My number 3, was it? Yeah, 3. My number 3 pick was The Great Escape. And similarly to albums like Park Life and Modern Life is Rubbish, The Great Escape is just 100% pure Britpop goodness. But the thing that separates it from those 2 is, without giving too much away about Park Life, because I haven't talked about it yet, is this album feels a lot more glamorous. It's a lot more theatrical, a lot more grandiose, and it makes for some absolutely magical moments. Tracks like Charmless Man, Country House, and of course the absolutely incredible The Universal are each standouts in Blur's discography, and at its best, this album just delivers absolutely incredible and just beautiful and theatrical moments. However, I do have one little issue with this project, and I think it becomes a little inconsistent towards the end. I think there's still some highlights in the latter half of the album, like He Thought of Cars or Globe Alone, but most of the back end of this project is just a little serviceable at most, and it doesn't really strike a chord with me like the highlights do. But overall, I mean, I still think this is a top-notch Blur album, and Universal is probably my second favorite Blur track. Thinking
That's
about
fair.
it now.
That's totally fair.
Indeed.
Well, my number 3 pick was Modern Life is Rubbish. Pardon my French, I fucking love this album. This album is so good. I remember my introduction to Blur was Park Life, So I was already very enthralled with the Britpop sound. And I thought that if I went back and I listened to the earlier albums that, maybe they would have the, cool Britpop-y sounds that just weren't as refined as Parklife. Went back and listened to Leisure. Very confused. Very bored. But then I threw on Modern Life is Rubbish, and I was blown away. Like, this album, I think you said it, Nostalgia, where it's like, this album makes it look like that Leisure doesn't even exist. Like, this is where Blur begins. And honestly, in this era, it was 1993 when this album came out, you had two things. You had Suede, their self-titled, and this album. And I think that even though the Suede album is an influence on the genre, this is where I believe the birth of the mega popular genre that would sweep the nation of Britannia in the 90s started. This is an instant improvement on every single front. Like, again, doesn't even compare to Leisure. And it I don't know. It just kind of makes it look like that album got deleted from the discography. And this album is so entertaining, so catchy. Like, I feel like this is exactly what, like, it's like a window into early 90s Britain, where you have, the funny, silly songs like Advert, and then you have the intermission, which is playfully amazing. And I just think that this album is insanely good. It definitely is in the high echelon of Blur, and it's one of my favorite albums of all time, and it's only number 3. Like, this is the quality that this band was given out back in the day.
So, sorry. At my number 3 spot, like I said, I had 13. So 13 is Blur's most experimental album by a very slight margin. This one plays with longer, more complex song structures at times and diverse soundscapes like hazy noise rock to harrowing post-rock inspired ambience. For all of the emotional and physical turmoil that went into the process of making this album, I don't think it's actually that difficult of a listen. It's definitely darker than some of their other works, but I don't think that its darker tone sacrifices its enjoyability at all, really. I most admire Damon's willingness to open up on this album lyrically, which really leads to some truly moving moments on songs like No Distance to Run and Caramel. Of all of the albums in the Blur discog, I think this is the one that requires the most attention, and you have to spend the most amount of time with it to fully appreciate it. And the 2 biggest hits from this album, they're both in my top 5 favorite Blur songs. Like, Tender is absolutely life-affirming, and Coffee and TV, chef's kiss. And it might actually have the best video ever. And rest in peace, Milky. And rest in peace, Milky.
No.
We'll be missed.
Come on, man.
But yeah, that's it.
Bring back traumatic memories.
Is that it?
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah.
with that in mind, my favourite tracks from Parklife are Tracy Jack's End of a Century, Parklife, Bank Holiday, Badhead, To the End, Clover Over Dover, Magic America, Jubilee, This Is a Low, and Lot 105. My least favourite tracks are Far Out and London Loves.
My favourite tracks on The Great Escape are Stereotypes, Country House, Best Day, Charmless Man, Fade Away, The Universal, He Thought of Cars, It Could Be You, and Globe Alone. My least favourite track is Top Man.
I'm sorry, I feel like there's something. Did you say London Loves in the least favorite?
Yes, I said yeah, that song bores the shit out of me. I'm sorry.
Oh my god.
If it's no, it could have been worse. I considered. No, dude, you don't understand. It could have been worse. I considered putting Girls and Boys in worse tracks too.
The fuck?
What are you?
I'm sorry. I don't like the.
What the fuck is that about?
I don't like the hook.
Oh, dude. Oh, that song. Oh, man, I'm gonna have scoliosis by the end of this episode. Oh. Okay. Ooh, all right. Ugh. Back in form. My favorites on Modern Life is Rubbish were For Tomorrow, Advert, Colin Zeal, Star Shaped, Blue Jeans. Underrated song. Blue Jeans is amazing. If any of you haven't heard that song, listen to it. It's amazing. Anyways, Chemical World, Intermission, Sunday Sunday, Oily Water, and Miss America. And my least favorite is Resigned.
My favorite tracks from 13 were Coffee and TV, Caramel, Trim Trab, Tender, No Distance Left to Run. The reason I put those two at the end is because I was thinking about how the album starts on a very uplifting note and ends on an absolutely heartbreaking note. So I imagine what this album would have been like if those had been swapped. Anyways, interesting, just stupid things I think of. And my least favorites are Bluremi and Optigan 1. And I cannot believe that the Caretakers stole his entire aesthetic from that song. Ridiculous.
All right. Top 2. And for me, my number 2 pick is Blur's Self-Titled.
Wow.
My number 2 pick is 13.
Ooh. My number 2 pick is 13.
Are you boys ready for this? Because I don't think you are. My number 2 spot is Parklife.
Wow. That's interesting, to say the least.
We're in it
All
now.
right, so we're in the shit now. Let's go. So, Blur's self-titled album. The beginning of a new era in the band's musical journey and an evolution from the band's initial Britpop sound. Plus this album, more specifically the track Song 2, would eventually break the band into an American audience for the first time, and the irony of that is both hilarious and just great, to say the least. And in my eyes, that's, obviously mostly because they abandoned the Brit aspects of their music in favor of some sounds and ideas that we'd normally find in the world of 90s American alt-rock, but with influences that also stem from more artful yet noisy and rough sounds. And while Blur would, go on to perfect these sounds soon after, spoilers for my number 1 if it wasn't already fucking obvious, I still feel like they managed to make a really great album out of what they explored on here, and it pays off for them in numerous aspects, in my opinion. I suppose this rougher and more brooding sound is something that I'm more invested in over their Britpop sound, but either way, I feel like Damon and the lads managed to encapsulate a more artistically nuanced sound while also keeping it relatively accessible. It's kind of odd through and through, but I really enjoyed what they present in this very dense yet slacker rock-esque sound palette. The production in this album is way more fuzzy and raw, it's very piercing and noisy, and the performances from the lads are just still great. There's some fantastic bass grooves and drum parts all over this thing. I love the guitar work and the riffage. The very mangled leads are great too, I love them. And Damon Albarn sounds really great over this instrumentation with this very kind of gloomy and somewhat chaotic energy to him. He's a bit of an enigma on this album, and I really appreciate that aspect of it. I feel like this is easily one of Blur's most consistent albums too for me. I feel like the tracklist is chock full of some of the most interesting material that Blur have ever made, some of their best tracks ever on this album. And despite some moments that do feel a bit all over the place and kind of boring, I do think that it's oddly cohesive. So yeah, I really like Blur's Self-Titled. I think it's one of the band's, best albums ever. It's definitely one of the best in their discography, in my opinion. This album also has my favorite Blur song on it, but I will get there eventually. And I feel like this was just such an interesting evolution from what the band were doing prior to this album's release. And place it higher, you fucking cowards, I beg.
You can't fucking comment on our takes when you said you don't like girls and boys.
True.
That song is okay, man, duh.
You've
That
lost
song
that
is
privilege.
amazing.
I have not lost any fucking privileges because I'm based like that. Fuck you.
Wait, did anyone else go for Blur? I think it's me next. All right. I went with 13, which was an album that I honestly entertained the thought of putting first, but there's an album that just to me stands above the rest, and admittedly mostly due to just personal preference and nostalgia. But while Blur's Self-Titled was, in my opinion, I'll preface it by saying my opinion, a slightly misguided attempt at a more experimental, gritty and psychedelic approach, I think 13 hits the nail on the head where their Self-Titled just didn't quite manage to. At this point, the term Britpop only really applies if you're just grouping everything the band ever released under that term because, you're using it as an umbrella term or something. 13 is just an eclectic and sonically dense project, and they're their most varied album from start to finish, and one that sees Blur at their most ambitious. Instrumentally, this album is rather dark and somber at its core, but it really keeps things exciting throughout with some more noisy, more psychedelics, and at times even progressive moments. It manages to implement some, even trip-hop elements. There's a car fucking beeping outside. And Damon and Graham, mind you, both sound fantastic on here. And, songs like Tender and Coffee and TV are just masterpieces. They're incredible tracks, incredible standout moments in a band's discography. And from start to finish, I think this is Blur's alternative rock stage at its most refined, at its most captivating, and at its most well executed. And it really doesn't have any bad moments. It has maybe one or two tracks that aren't that memorable, but overall, it's an incredible project.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree on that one. These next two albums is peak Blur, and especially for their experimental side and where they went into the alt rock introspective nature of their music. This is the absolute peak of that. When my next two albums, if anyone says either of them is their favorite, I'm like, yes. They're I mean, 13 is on another level for Blur. If you thought that it was dark and sad lyrically on the self-titled, like, oh man, like it's honestly, it's just really sad. It just feels like an album that you are just watching at this point in their discography. Damon kind of feels like a friend because of how friendly the early era of the band was, and how open that was, and other aspects that I will briefly mention in Park Life. But it's just one of those albums where it's you get to the self-titled, and Damon just seems very sad and down and out, and he was, and even on 13 it just becomes sadder, and it's like you're watching a friend cry in front of you. It's a really poignant album, and I mean, any album that starts with Tender, I mean, damn, we're in for one. We're in for a sad time. And not to say that there aren't bangers or moments of high ethereal moments like Bugman or Trim Trab. These songs are all amazing, and if I can say, even though this isn't my absolute favorite Blur album, Coffee and TV, best Blur song in my opinion. That is, I know that it's a very normie take for a Blur fan, but that song is absolutely perfect. And again, Graham coming in with his lyrics and his vocals, and honestly, he should have written and sung more songs. But this album is an absolute masterpiece, and if you aren't captivated by Tender at the beginning and going through this entire journey, and at the end of it bawling your eyes out during No Distance Left to Run, I don't know what to tell you. This might not be the band for you.
So, Park Life. So, Park Life used to be my favorite Britpop album, but then I came across Pulp, and for a while it was tied, and then I just had to go with a different class. Sorry to Josh in particular, but the competition, it is very, very, very tight. Park Life shows Blur in peak form when it comes to writing pop songs. Pretty much every single song on here is an example of a great pop song. Even the songs that are less than 2 minutes are awesome. I can only try so hard to look at this album from a critical lens. I've been a fan of this band for short of a decade now, and it's at the point where I just can't find anything wrong with it, and the reason it's not my number one spot is because there's one I just like a little bit more. As I mentioned already, I lived in London for a little bit when I was 18, and that experience really gave me a whole new appreciation for this album. And actually, that kind of just applies to the Britpop era of Blur in general. I thought that trying to assimilate into the culture that inspired this album was an interesting experience, but unfortunately, I didn't end up running into Phil Daniels in the street, so it was kind of a waste of time to go there. But anyways, Parklife is the second best Britpop album, and it's my second favorite Blur album.
All right. And yeah, my favorite tracks from Blur's self-titled, basic bitch pick for my favorite Blur song. It's song 2, MOR, On Your Own, theme from Retro, Death of a Party, Chinese Bombs, Beetle Bum, Country, Sad Ballad Man, and Essex Dogs. My least favorite track is Moving On.
My favorite tracks on 13 are Tender, Bugman, Coffee and TV, Swamp Song, 1992, Battle, Mellow Song, Trailer Park, Carmel, Trim Trab, No Distance Left to Run. My least favorite track, if I had to pick, would be Blue Remy.
My favorites on 13 were Tender, Bugman, Coffee and TV, 1992, Mellow Song, Trailer Park, Caramel, Trim Trab, No Distance Left to Run. This album's amazing. My least favorite is Optigon 1.
My favorite tracks from Parklife were the title track, of course, Girls and Boys, Tracy Jacks, End of a Century, Bad Head, To the End. Shout out to Letitia from Stereolab for providing backing vocals on To the End. Magic America, Trouble in the Message Center, which probably is the most badass intro of any Blur song, if you were to ask me. And This Is a Low. And my least favorite is Far Out.
And we're at the number 1 spot. And if it wasn't blatantly obvious already, my number 1 pick is 13.
And mine is Parklife.
Thanks for being here with me, Nostalgia. My number 1 pick is Parklife, but never mind me. Connor, you have the floor.
My number 1 pick, and this is where we go from me ranking them in terms of worst to best to just saying favorites. Like, I love this group. They're one of my favorite bands. Like ranking them was painful. But my number 1 pick might be even more painful to you guys based on where you guys had this album on your ranked list. But my personal favorite Blur album is Think Tank.
That's spicy, alright.
Here we are.
We made it. Oh, shit. Alright, so... yes. 13. Easily one of the most ambitious and large records in the Blur discography. And for me, it's hands down their absolute best, in my opinion. You know, in many ways, 13 is like their self-titled. It's still straying away from Blur's Britpop tendencies and instead focuses more on an alternative rock and noise rock aesthetic, which also contained elements of neo-psychedelia, experimental rock, and even trip-hop in some cases. But the song structures are getting lengthier and more ambitious. The tone of this thing is just pure moody and melancholic, and generally speaking, I think that they generally pay off pretty well with some of Blur's most interesting, engaging, and submersive material ever. You know, at the time, Damon Albarn was going through a split from a long-term relationship, which was, heavily affecting him and his mental state at the time, and it's showing in spades all over this album with the songwriting, since it's often just very dark, melancholic, and even at times very isolated. The writing is made even more reflective and stand out because of the instrumentation on this thing too, which is really damn great. It's easily some of the best that the band have ever done, and I messed with it heavy. I think the album is just filled to the brim with some fantastic instrumentals that are just so, as I described them earlier, moody, and they just engross you in the soundscapes and atmospheres that they present. It's dense as hell, and every bit of noise and ambience just culminates into an oddly gratifying yet nocturnal experience. I love the noisy guitar work all over this thing. I love the way the instrumentals build upon themselves, and the dronier aspects are done justice by the band's almost jam session-like performances. I think that Damon Albarn I think that Damon Albarn's honesty and emotion is bleeding through on each consecutive track, and I really appreciate what he does in this album. And for me, this album just has some of Blur's best songs ever. Let me say that again. Fuck's sake. For me, this album just has some of Blur's best songs that have been written from a lyrical and compositional standpoint. For me, some of Blur's absolute best songs are on here too. Some of my favorite Blur songs of all time are on here. I feel like it's one of the band's most consistent efforts today, and generally speaking, I just feel like this was a moment where Blur managed to peak artistically. So yeah, I love this album. I think that's really great. For me, it's easily their best album. It's my favorite one. And yeah, 13, good.
I mean, I can explain why were at a loss of words, because the album's just so damn good.
Yes.
Whose turn is it now?
Yours.
It's yours.
All right. I went with the band's third album, Park Life. And think back to everything I said about modern life is rubbish, about how Blur tackle, being a middle class British citizen, and just the mundane aspects of life and everything in between. Everything that they tackled on that project, they just turn up tenfold on this album. It's just pure Britpop goodness. Park Life is just, I think, the pinnacle of Britpop. It's the pinnacle of Blur. And, Damon Albarn and company take their already established sound to more anthemic, more memorable, more fulfilling strides in their commentary on British life, on British culture, in an absolutely spectacular way. The songwriting is timelessly relevant. Performances range from wildly chaotic to hypnotically mellow. Tracks like Boys and Girls, Park Life, and This Is a Low are just absolute classics. And in my opinion, this is just Blur at their most creative, at their most exciting, at their most enthralling, and Park Life is just the pinnacle of Britpop. And Mick, I'm sorry to say this, but Boys and Girls is the best Blur song, period.
You're funny.
It is.
I see where he's coming from, though.
Oh no! Oh no!
Oh yes!
Oh no!
Thank you for bringing that up. Nostalgia. This album is almost. Oh, it pains me. Almost perfect. This is maybe a basic pick. I mean, it's either Park Life or 13. I mean, in my opinion, those are the two best albums. So it can go either way. But Park Life is a masterpiece album. God damn, this album is so British and so wonderful. Like I can't even. Where do I even start? I'm never been to England, never been to the UK. I would love to one day, and partly because of the experience that I've had with this album, it sounds like, at least for the time, it sounded like just what an experience to be a British citizen. And you have the songs like Girls and Boys that I'll bring up, where honestly that song, this was back in the 90s, for the time, that song was very, very progressive, and I love the message of that song where, that goddamn, that song is so catchy. It's so good, and it's just, it's a great rip-roaring good time about freedom of sexuality. Doesn't matter who you're into, just as long as it's someone you really love. It's just that song is amazing. And fun fact, this isn't gonna help my case at all, but Tom York was actually asked one time if there was a song that he wished that he had written, and he said it was Girls and Boys. And I just think that that's hilarious. Like, imagine Radiohead and Tom York singing Girls and Boys. That would be amazing. But this album is just fantastic. Like, I don't know how else to say it. I mean, it's just classic and pinnacle Britpop. It's everything you'd ask for from both the genre and the band. It's just a fun time with really interesting songs and stories. Like Bank Holiday is such a fun song about, the holiday that happens, and I love how the song just explains what the holiday is. But it's such a banger. Like, this album is I can't say enough good things, and especially to the people who do enjoy the first two Oasis albums. It's like, come on, people. But like Blur, I'm sorry. I know that this is opinion. This is all a matter of subjectivity. Blur is better than Oasis. I don't care how many times you've cried to Wonderwall or Don't Look Back in Anger. Like, this album and 13 and Modern Life and just majority of their albums prove, like, I feel like that it proves it. And I don't know. It's just album's so damn wonderful. If you haven't heard it, just listen to it. It's a good time. If you can't have a good time listening to this album, either you're not paying attention or you're just dead inside.
Okay. I'm going to try to keep this short because I'm going to be honest with you guys. I have like pretty much no defense for having this album, for having Think Tank at my number one. And I'm going to just throw up the white flag and say and surrender. Okay. But with that said, this is my favorite Blur album. I think the biggest reason why that is because you've got Gorillaz, who were one of the groups that formed my music taste, introduced me to MF Doom, which became my introduction to hip hop. I discovered what trip hop was there. And then, so yeah, Gorillaz. We said this was sort of like a Gorillaz album, right? And then you also have Blur, as I've shown through what I've said already, is also one of my favorite groups. So when you put those two things together, good shit happens. And good shit happens on Think Tank, and it happens very often. Honestly, I think that's the reason why, that's one of the reasons why I set my number one. And the other reason is just how goddamn good, like, the songs are. Crazy Beat is good. I don't know why people don't like that song. It's grown off me, like, maybe a little bit. But I like the experimentation that's elsewhere on this record. Like on Jets, like the free jazz solo at the end of that. The other Fatboy Slim produced song, Gene by Gene, slaps. I love that they use like a mattress, like being jumped on as like percussion. It's just great. There's so many like unique things going on in this record. I think it's a pretty cohesive album, if I'm being honest with you guys. And yeah, I'm like pretty much just like pulling shit out of my ass right now, describing why I think this is my number one. But that's just, I guess it's just the way it is. Like, I don't know. It's my favorite.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah. I'm going to have to write a full review for this thing because I have much more to say then. And I also, you can probably tell I didn't write any notes. I was completely random just now. But yeah. Think Tank. Is it objectively the best Blur album? Maybe not. In my opinion, it is.
Objectively, he says, okay.
That was such a horrible description of Think Tank.
It's better than nothing.
I suppose.
Alright, so with that in mind, my favourite tracks from 13 are Bugman, Battle, Trailer Park, Caramel, Trim Trab, No Distance Left to Run, Tender, Coffee and TV, Blue Remy, and Mellow Song. If I had to pick a least favourite, I would go with 1992.
My favorite tracks on Park Life are all of them bar Far Out, and my least favorite track is Far Out.
Yeah, I'll agree with that one, but just in case people want specifics, because there is a couple there is like one other song that's not gonna make it on either list, but if you'll just let me, you ready? Girls and Boys, Tracy Jacks, End of a Century, Park Life, Bank Holiday, Bad Head, To the End, London Loves, Trouble in the Message Center, Clover Over Dover, Magic America, Jubilee, This Is a Low, and Lot 105. My least favorite is Far Out.
That's a really far out pick for your least favorite. Huh?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I know.
Comedy.
My favorite tracks on Think Tank are Ambulance, Out of Time, On the Way to the Club, Caravan, Sweet Song, Gene by Gene, Battery in Your Leg, and It's Me White Noise, which none of you mentioned, which I'm disappointed in. And my least favorite, I guess if I had to pick one, I'd pick the interlude, We've Got a File on You, but that song still rips. So, yeah.
Yeah, we did it. We ranked the whole Blur discography. That was fun, lads. Thank you guys so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for
There's some
finally
interesting
talking
things
about
for
this
this one.
amazing band. Like, oh man, I've been waiting to talk about Blur for a long time. Like, oh, so good.
Yeah, I can imagine. We had this planned for ages, but glad it finally happened.
yeah.
And it was worth the wait too. There were so many fucking weird takes in this one that I thought were really fucking funny. So there's that.
Oh yeah.
I had to make my first appearance like in a while, make a splash, and I think I did that with putting Think Tank at number 1.
Absolutely.
Oh, you definitely did.
Yeah,
You definitely did.
gotta keep it
All right,
interesting.
so yeah, I'll do the outro now. So yeah, thank you guys so much for checking out today's episode of the Taped Podcast. We really hope that you enjoyed. Once again, Koner and Josh, thank you guys so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you on here talking about Blur. And as always, be sure there'll be links in the description to both of their Album of the Year pages. And of course, there'll be links in the description to other episodes of the Taped Podcast. There is going to be links to me and Nostalgia's own Rate Your Music pages and Album of the Year pages. And I think it's fair to announce this now, but there'll be a link in the description to the Cassette Tapes Discord server. So if you want to join that, please do and join the discussion and the banter that we have there. And yeah, with that in mind, my name's been MickyT.
I'm Nostalgia.
And I've been Josh.
I've been Dan.
See ya!
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Shite life.